TFA fam, welcome back in. We are moving on to week 4. We have our top 24 running back rankings for you. So, without further ado, let's just dive right in and give the people what they want. Kev, start off with our RB1s for week 4. They are as such. We have Christian McCaffrey sitting at the top, followed by Tony Pollard, Bijan Robinson, Kenneth Walker, Travis Etienne, Josh Jacobs, James Cook, Derrick Henry, Raheem Mostert coming off of his massive performance. Kyron Williams, Zach Moss in our top 12. Definitely didn't have that one on my bingo card. And then Miles Sanders wrapping up our top 12 for week 4. Kev, the RB1s, who do you like in here? Who do you think the folks need to know about for week 4?
Without further ado, Kenneth Walker has been fantastic so far to start the season. 62% of the RB rush attempts and a 22% target per route run rate, which is the ninth highest rate among all running backs, which is something you love to see. He is 20th in yards after contact per attempt, but he is 5th in missed tackles forced per attempt, 7th in carries of 10 plus yards, 8th in elusive rating. But he's also 7th in yards per route run, and the RB3 on the season, 19.9 fantasy points per game. Now, this week they get a great matchup against the Giants, who allowed the 4th most rushing yards, the 5th most touchdowns, and the 6th most PPR points to the position. So fire up Ken Walker with absolute confidence. Next up, let's talk about that James Cook, currently at RB12 through 3 weeks of the season, but he's averaging an impressive 6.1 yards per carry and 14.4 fantasy points per game. He's currently averaging also 14.5 carries per game, which is 14th most and the 15th most targets per game among all running backs. He has been ultra efficient, 3rd in yards after contact per attempt, 10th in missed tackles forced per attempt, and 17th in yards per route run. And then now this week they get Miami, who has allowed the 10th most fantasy points to the position. So I really like James Cook this week. Really good matchup. This is one of the better matchups of the week between these two teams. Next up, let's talk about Josh Jacobs. And he has kind of been tough this year because he hasn't really been all that impressive in terms of fantasy points or really been giving a lot of fantasy owners much things to be encouraged by. But I think all the other things are there. His 80% snap share is the highest among all running backs in the league. 71% of the RB rush attempts on this team, which is top 5 among all running backs. 57% routes run, and he has the 8th highest target per route run rate among all running backs. So the usage is there. It's just the production just hasn't been so far. He hasn't been efficient at all. 47th in yards after contact per attempt, 19th in missed tackles forced, and 9th in yards per route run, which has been his one saving grace. But Josh Jacobs does get a good matchups this week against the LA Chargers. They've allowed the 12th most rushing yards, 9th most touchdowns, and 13th in fantasy points per game. Josh Jacobs should start to improve. I mean, the usage is there. As long as those things continue, they're eventually going to figure this thing out. And he is going to start producing. He may not, I don't think he's going to return to being the guy he was last year, right? He's probably not going to be a top 3, top 4, top 5 running back this year, but I think he can at least finish as a top 10 running back. And I think better days are ahead of Josh Jacobs, which makes him probably one of the better buy low candidates you can get right now, considering the usage he sees. So next up, let's talk about DeAndre Swift. Welcome back, DeAndre Swift. He is not in our consensus top 12. I have him as a top 12 running back, but he has now had back-to-back 100-yard rushing games, 16 carries this past week for 130 yards against the Bucs. He has racked up 305 rushing yards over the last 2 games. Now, we did see Kenneth Gainwell back. Kenneth Gainwell did see 14 carries in his return, but only managed 48 total yards. I think it is clear that DeAndre Swift is the best running back in this backfield. And now this week they do get not a great matchup against the Washington Commanders. Commanders have allowed the 18th most rushing yards, but they have allowed 4.3 yards per carry, which is the 10th most among all teams this year. They've been in some positive game scripts, which has kind of gone away from that. So their 59 total attempts is bottom half of the league. And so I think some of these numbers are a little bit deceiving because they have also allowed the 13th most touchdowns, but the 19th most fantasy points. Some of this is game script dependent of the reason this is. So I'm not all that concerned. We just saw DeAndre Swift absolutely eviscerate the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and they have one of the best run defenses in the league. So DeAndre Swift looks super explosive right now, and you love to see it. So Zach Moss, let's talk about him really quickly. 56% of the RB rush attempts for him, 41% of the routes, and a 12% target share in this offense for Zach Moss. He's really the main guy in this backfield. He did have a tough matchup this past week against the Baltimore Ravens, but managed to put up over 100 yards and a score. He hasn't been super efficient, 38th in yards after contact per attempt, 1st in missed tackles forced, and 25th in PFF elusive rating, and 26th in yards per route run. but he is 7th in fantasy points per game through the first 2 starts that he's seen this season. So I do think this is a good matchup. The Rams offense isn't one that we should be all that concerned with. He just gave up over 70 yards and a score to Joe Mixon tonight, and Joe Mixon has done absolutely nothing to start the season. So this Rams defense is one that you can definitely run the football against. So I do like Zach Moss this week. And then lastly, Jerome Ford against Baltimore. Jerome Ford dominated the snaps this past week with 40-14 of Kareem Hunt. He also ran considerably more routes, 21-5 of Hunt's. But he has also been incredibly efficient, 7th in yards after contact per attempt, 10th in missed tackles forced, 25th in yards per route run. Now, it wasn't a great game for him. 10 carries, 18 yards, but he did find the end zone twice in that game. He also had 2 catches for 33 yards and 19.1 fantasy points for Jerome Ford. Now, we have to remember this was against the Tennessee Titans. The Titans' run defense is absolutely elite. And so, Jerome Ford, I think, is an absolute must-play again this week against Baltimore, who have allowed the 16th most rushing yards and the 18th most fantasy points to running back. So love to see it for Jerome Ford. Looks like he could be a league winner by the season's end.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to the RB2s for week 4, which are as follows. We have Jerome Ford kicking it off at 13, followed by Aaron Jones, DeAndre Swift, Ramondre Stevenson, Joe Mixon, Jahmyr Gibbs, Javonte Williams, Alexander Mattison, Alvin Kamara, making his debut, Isaiah Pacheco, Brian Robinson, and James Conner at RB24. Kev, same deal. Who are some of these RB2s that the folks should know about for week 4?
First off, let's talk about Ramondre Stevenson. And things haven't been great for Ramondre for the most part this year. While he has played 71% of the snaps, he's only seeing 53% of the RB rush attempts, but he is running 61% of the routes, but only a 10% target share, which is pretty down from what he saw last year. You have to remember last year was like 18-19% target share within that offense. Now, he's been pretty bad despite 2 of the last 3 weeks scoring 15 fantasy points. His lack of targets and this is one of the aspects that he thrived in last year. He does have 5 carries inside the red zone and one goal line carry, and Zeke only has 1 carry inside the 5 and 1 goal line carry so far to start the season. So he is getting that usage, but he just hasn't really been able to convert much on those opportunities. And the efficiency is absolutely in the shitter right now. 51st in yards after contact per attempt, 30th in yards per route run, but he's averaging 12.3 fantasy points per game. Now, some people might say, why would I even want to talk about him? They're playing the Dallas Cowboys. I think their numbers are a little bit misleading so far through the first 3 games. They've allowed the second lowest fantasy points to running backs, but I think this is game script and it's really misleading because you have to remember in those first 2 games, they annihilated the first 2 teams they played, and those teams really couldn't run the football because they got absolutely the doors blown off of them and really forced them to throw the ball. And so that is something we should definitely take into consideration because we just saw James Conner go over 100 yards in scoring against this team. And they've also had the 3rd lowest rush attempts against, but they've also had a 5.8 yards per carry average allowed so far to start the season. So I do think that this is a sneaky spot for Ramondre Stevenson to get right. I know people are going to see the matchup and be afraid of it, but I do think that Dallas Cowboys, you can definitely run the football against this team. So Ramondre Stevenson is somebody that I still feel confident in. He's going to turn it around. The opportunities are still there for him. I'm not still worried about Ezekiel Elliott. I think better things are ahead for Ramondre Stevenson. So next up, hey, welcome back, Alvin Kamara. Many fantasy owners are going to be happy with him coming back this week, especially with the state of the running back position. But this isn't a great matchup against one of the best run defenses in the league. They're allowing a 3.3 yards per carry, which is the 5th lowest rate in the league. Like I said, with the state of the running back position, you're probably going to need him this week. You're probably going to have to fire him up. And we also know he has elite pass catching usage as well. So that should help Alvin Kamara because Lord knows the running backs they have there right now can't do a damn thing. So welcome back, Alvin Kamara, from your suspension. Next up, this is a dicey one. Javonte Williams versus Chicago. Now, he has seen 55% of the RB rush attempts, but he's only run 30% of the routes. But he's seen an electric 29% target per route run rate, which is top 5 among all running backs. Game script has largely hindered Javonte the last 2 weeks. Giving up 105 total points over the last 2 weeks is going to always be a problem for any running back. And Javonte is still the lead back here, despite the involvement of Samaje Perine and Jaleel McLaughlin hasn't helped. But he has scored only double-digit fantasy points once. This is where everything gets good. Because the Bears have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs, the 10th most rushing yards, the 6th most rushing touchdowns, and the 2nd most receiving yards to running backs, and the most receiving touchdowns to the running back position. So this should be a get right game. We should not be worried about game script here because the Bears offense has looked as inept as the Denver Broncos defense has. Their offense cannot do anything right now. So this should be a matchup that Javonte Williams can get right in. So a matchup against Chicago couldn't come at a better time, and Javonte Williams should bounce back. Now, I'm not saying that I think Javonte is going to be some RB1 this week, but I think he can at least be a solid RB2 this week in a great matchup against the Chicago Bears. So I do want to point that out. And then next, let's talk about Alexander Mattison. Now, this is a dicey one because we don't know how Cam Akers is going to mix in here. Alexander Madison's usage has been elite. 76% of the snaps, 78% of the RB rush attempts, which is first among all running backs, 58% of the routes run, and a 12% target share. Now, the problem with Alexander Mattison has been the thing that everybody's been talking about is his absolutely dreadful efficiency numbers. 32nd in yards after contact per attempt, 42nd in yards per route run, 41st in missed tackles forced, but he is third in carries inside the 5-yard line, and he's 23rd in fantasy points per game. Now, he is coming off a decent game this past week, but it still was dreadful in terms of efficiency numbers. And Carolina, though, versus running backs has been a thing that we want to target. They've allowed the 5th most rushing yards, the 2nd most rushing touchdowns, the 12th most receiving yards to running backs, and the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So this is a great matchup for Alexander Mattison, but we cannot deny that Cam Akers likely will be healthy for this. Cam Akers knows this system. He come with Kevin O'Connell coming from the Sean McVay tree. So that is going to be something we're going to have to watch. But I do think Alexander Mattison, at least for now, is going to have a stranglehold over this offense until we see differently. So, and then lastly, Isaiah Pacheco versus the New York Jets. Now, his usage has been fine. 47% of the snaps, 43% of the RB carries, 41st in routes run, and an 8% target share, which is a boost from what we saw from him last year. But he is 8th in missed tackles forced. He is 26th in yards after contact per attempt on the season. And the New York Jets are a team that you can run the football against. They've allowed the 7th most rushing yards, the 5th most receiving yards to running backs, but only the 14th most fantasy points to running backs. And that is only because they've allowed 0 touchdowns to the running back position. I think that changes this week. I think Isaiah Pacheco can find the end zone. He did turn in a top 10 RB week this past week. I did Isaiah Pacheco. So while I would like to be a little bit more involved overall, I think you can count on probably 14 to 16 touches and what should be an absolute blowout on Sunday Night Football against Zach Wilson and the Jets.
Yeah, I like McKinnon in this matchup too. I think if you're in a deeper league and you're in need of a flex spot, I think you can throw him in just because of the defensive matchup. I know you were going over some of those numbers there, but I think McKinnon could be a sneaky type play. And then just the last thing I want to throw in here, something we have to monitor is the David Montgomery situation. Did get in a limited practice today, so if he's good to go in this matchup against Green Bay's defense, I think he should come in as like a mid RB2. Obviously, we have to wait and see what happens with him. It was also so weird seeing Jahmyr Gibbs. We thought he was going to be in line for a bunch of targets. Obviously, they didn't need to throw a bunch in that game because of the game script. But to only see 2 and then Craig Reynolds mixing in on like the 3rd down work and Jahmyr Gibbs was basically used in the David Montgomery role. It was just a weird how that all worked out. But like I said, if David Montgomery is back, I do like him in this spot going up against the Green Bay defense.
Yeah, and lastly, I just want to hit on a couple RB3s that we have here that I think some people are going to have some questions about. Dameon Pierce being one of them. I kind of almost had as an RB2, then I kind of moved him down a little bit to an RB3 because I'm not ready to hurt again. I know last week he scored almost 15 fantasy points, against the Jaguars, which is something I kind of thought was funny because we kind of said, not that he had a monster day, but, in our game day show last week, we talked about him. I said, watch, he's going to, have a decent day and nobody's going to play him. And that's exactly what he did. He's handled 49% of the snaps, but 55% of the RB rush attempts, 36% the routes run by running backs, and 8% target share. But he's very game script dependent. As long as the Texans can keep it close, Pierce should have an opportunity to build off the 15-point fantasy performance he had against the Jags. It's just tough to trust. But I will say this. Pittsburgh has struggled against the run this year. 2nd most rushing yards allowed. They have allowed the 9th most rushing touchdowns and 4th in fantasy points per game to the running back position. So this is a good matchup for Dameon Pierce, and one that I think that they can definitely keep this game close against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So I do think, and it is a home matchup, so you want to play Dameon Pierce in the flex, but I don't love it. And we've seen this, for the first couple of weeks where he did absolutely nothing, and that's what worries me. He was able to fall into the end zone and score a touchdown because the other numbers were not there for him whatsoever. And then lastly, in the same game, Jalen Warren. We saw it last week. His numbers are getting closer and closer to overtaking Najee Harris on the season. He's now playing 42% of the snaps. He's handled 27% of the rush attempts, but 41% of the routes run, and a 15% target share, and a 32% target per route run rate, which is top 3 among all running backs right now. He is also 4th in yards per route run, 33rd in yards after contact per attempt, and Houston has allowed the 7th most fantasy points to running back. So this is a good matchup for Jalen Warren, and it looks more and more and more likely that Najee Harris is going to end up taking a back seat at some point to Jalen Warren. Jalen Warren is just too explosive. He's just a better running back than Najee Harris is. It's time for people that the defenders of Najee Harris to lay their swords down and accept defeat, because Jalen Warren is definitely the better running back in this backfield right now. He is the more explosive one, and he feels like Tony Pollard 2.0. And lastly, I just want to hit on Josh Kelly really quickly. Great matchup this week against the Raiders. Fantastic matchup this week. But no shot am I playing Josh Kelly. We have now seen in back-to-back games that he looks like absolute dog shit. Like, he is not a good running back. I think we should have known this prior to this season in the years past, that he's been given opportunities and never done anything with them. Yes, I know he had a 90-yard game this at start the season, but that was largely because the Dolphins did not care and said, please run the ball against us. We are not going to allow you to throw the ball. And that's what they were focused on. That was a fluke. We've now seen the past 2 weeks that he is terrible. He did absolutely nothing against the Minnesota Vikings team that you could run the football against all day. And so I am out on Josh Kelly. Unless you absolutely have to play him, I'm not playing him. Hopefully Austin Ekeler is back soon. But the problem with that is their bye week is coming, I believe, in week 5. And so that probably tells me that he's probably not going to get him back until after that. I think it's week 5 or week 6. So I don't think we're going to see Austin Ekeler until after their bye week.
That is going to do it. Please be sure to hit us with a like and a sub if you have yet to do so. We will be going live on Wednesday night to answer all of your start sit questions. We do that on Sundays as well. You can also drop any questions you have in the comments below. We'll be sure to answer all of them as we can get to them. So thank you for joining us. We'll catch you on the next one. Goodbye.